Can you talk a little bit about the misunderstandings about evolution?
Yes. So there's 3 common myths that I hear about evolution. And one of them is this. Evolution is atheism, or evolution is atheistic or something, right? And that's just simply not true. Atheism is the belief that there is no God, that God does not exist, that there are no gods. Evolution, the biological theory of evolution, is explanation about how life developed on Earth, right? So one is simply describing a process of how life formed and developed, and another one is saying there's no God. Right. So clearly those two things are different, right? Yeah. So that's one, I think, common misunderstanding. And maybe an analogy. If you and I could describe in great detail, which we, people out there can, physicians, doctors can describe in great detail the process in which, the sperm and an egg, after they're joined, develop into like a full-grown baby over 9 months, right? And we can describe that process, right, with some detail. Right. But to describe that process would be one thing. It'd be another thing to say like, oh, and by the way, there's no mother and father. Yeah. Right? That's a completely different claim, right? And I think simply because people have explanations for the process of how these things go, that's not to say that there's no mother and father, right? Or that there's no God. When we're talking about the process of how things develop versus like, okay, is there a mother or father? Is there a God? That's a completely different question, right? So evolution's not trying to be so ambitious as to say like, oh, like let's cut God out. All it's just trying to do is look at the formation of life in the history of the world. The second common misunderstanding that I hear is, according to evolution, humans came from monkeys, right? Which again is not true. So the story of evolution isn't that we came from monkeys, that like monkeys gave birth to humans at some point in history. It's that human beings and chimpanzees, we share a common ancestor, right? So again, those two things, hopefully people recognize, are obviously different. It's one thing to say that monkeys gave birth to humans. It's another thing to say that human beings and chimpanzees, that we share some common ancestor. And the same way that we might say that, like German shepherds and wolves share a common ancestor or something like that, if that makes sense. So that's a second common misunderstanding. The third one that Christians often say is like, oh, evolution is just a theory, right? It's like the theory of evolution. Well, it's just a theory, right? It's not fact or something like that. I think the problem with that criticism is I think it's based upon a misunderstanding of how the term theory is used in science. So in science, when people use the term theory, they don't mean like, well, like this is kind of a theory that we're putting out there, but we don't really know. Like it's just a theory, right? The way that the term theory is used in science is like, this is a model for the data that we have, and all of the data is best explained by this model, by this theory. Right. So in science, you wouldn't talk about things being just a theory. Like there's the process where things move from hypothesis, and then like after experimentations, like and further data is collected and evidence is collected, we can say like, okay, this theory best explains all the data. It best explains the evidence, right? So what scientists typically mean by that term theory is something that's trying to explain the data.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really make sense to say like, oh, evolution's just a theory.
Sure.
When we have scientists are going to say, lots of scientists are going to say, we have all this data that makes sense with this theory. So, yeah.
So do you think that you can be a Christian and believe in evolution? And can you also talk a little bit about, in the Christian faith, we believe we're created in the image of God.
Yeah.
And that seems to be one of the biggest pieces of conflict with this idea that, you know, if we have a common ancestor with chimpanzees, how does that work in light of Genesis?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I certainly think you could be a Christian and believe in evolution. And I think that there's a spectrum of options. There's a spectrum of readings or interpretations you could have when you approach Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. So, you know, a common one is that what's described in those early chapters of Genesis is pretty much literal, right? It's essentially like a literal recounting of what happened. So, like on day 1, like God did this. On day 2, God did this. On day 3, and these days are literal 24-hour days that are coming one after the other.
Yeah.
Right. And like God literally took up dust and made a human being named Adam. God literally took the rib out of Adam and made a woman, right? So that's fine. That's fair. I think that's a fine explanation of if you want to read Genesis. But I don't think that the scriptures require you to hold that view, right? So, like, you know, is it possible that Genesis is teaching like that on day 1 God did this and on day 2 God did this? Is it possible that Genesis refers to these days as 24-hour days? Yeah, I think possibly, like maybe, but I don't think that that's necessarily the only way you could read it. So another, I think, reasonable interpretation is to say, well, like what's the author of these texts trying to say? Like, is he trying to give us a scientific sort of eyewitness record of what happened at the creation, right? A kind of like a science textbook sort of explanation. Or is the author trying to say something, I think, much deeper and much more profound than simply sort of giving us materialistic, scientific explanations of how the world was put together?
Right.
And if you look at it that way, there's really nothing incompatible about seeing God as the author of creation. God is the creator. Yeah. Right. And also believe that God could have used whatever means he wanted to bring about this creation. I don't see any conflict there. And, you know, like this another an illustration I sometimes give is that, you know, when we look at the world today, we see babies that are born, right? So like we've had babies that are born, and I would happily affirm like God made our children. God made our babies, right? God was the creator of our children, right? But when I say that, and when people hear like, oh, God made my baby, or God makes the babies that are born, right? We don't have this image of God making babies and it's just like baby, right. Baby, right? We also recognize that there's this 9-month process where there's a development over time, right? which to my mind doesn't touch the question of, did God make this baby? I would certainly affirm, of course God made the baby, but God could use means through which he brings about this baby, right? So I don't see any incompatibility between those two. I don't really see why we need to. And again, like, I think that if we're keeping in mind that the authors, the editors, the writers of the early chapters of Genesis, they weren't living, after the scientific revolution, right? They weren't living in a Western post-Enlightenment world with the understandings of like the laws of physics and like, force and pressure and biology and bacteria and all of these things. Those, I don't think they were stupid by any means. I don't think they were ignorant. But those weren't things that they were thinking about, right? Those weren't the primary questions that they were looking at the world through, right? And I think it's a lot more likely that they're writing this and reading this in a world where there's lots of stories about how the world came into being, that are false stories, that are stories in opposition to the God of Israel.
Right.
And so what Moses, or the author of Genesis, wants to say is like, no. Like, those stories don't get it right.
Yeah.
Like, let me tell you really how the world was created.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something to keep in mind, that, the Genesis account is obviously not the only creation story in the ancient world. There's lots of other creation stories, some of them that are older than the ones in Genesis. Right. So, like, maybe one helpful way to think about this is, let's suppose that there was this girl in like a really abusive relationship or something like that, right? And all these men in her life said really harmful, hurtful, abusive things about her body, about the way she looked, all this stuff, right? And then let's say eventually this girl entered into a relationship with like a good, loving partner. And this good, loving partner wrote this letter to this girl saying, like, your eyes are so beautiful, and on and on and on. And then, like, your mouth is so wonderful, blah, 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 like, and on and on and on. Like, your arms are so lovely, blah, 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 like, and on and on and on. And it would be a mistake to read that letter and think, like, is he trying to describe her biology? Right? Is he trying to say something about this girl's biology? Well, no, like, we need to read that letter against the backdrop of there's all these other men, these abusers that she's had in the past who have said all these harmful, destructive things about her body in the past. And this loving partner is trying to set it straight for this girl and say, like, hey, like, your body is good, it's beautiful, it's lovely, all these things. So he's not trying to give her a biology lesson, right? He's trying to say something, I think, more profound. And I think that is how we should probably approach the text of Genesis too, rather than trying to impose our sort of like, okay, like what are the years, what are the days, like, what's the mechanism that was being used? What are these sort of like very scientific sort of questions? I doubt that that's what the authors were thinking about or what they had in mind. That's much more an approach that we have after the rise of people like Isaac Newton and Galileo and Copernicus and Pascal and Pasteur and all of these amazing scientists who've done good work. But that's not necessarily the way that they approached the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Is there anything else that you want to say in regards to the Bible and evolution?
Yeah, I just that Christians can disagree about these topics, and that a disagreement on some of these questions doesn't entail that someone's undermining the authority of Scripture or something like that. And I would want to say, like, lest one thinks that, like, oh, this is just sort of like a liberal reading that's trying to accommodate for modern science or something like that. That's just that's not true, because we know that lots of people in the early church also read the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
In figurative, like, sort of metaphorical language, like reading it in a figurative way. Right. And this would have been long before like the theory of evolution really got off the ground.
Right.
So that way of approaching Scripture is nothing new in the history of the church. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that when they read, the stories about a talking snake, that they were so dumb that they wouldn't know, like, snakes can't talk.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think that they were well aware of those same kinds of oddities in the text. Right.
Yeah.
And we're trying to read Genesis according to the strangeness in it. So,
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful. And I think important, especially for people who have felt like, well, I see all of this in science, which seems to make a lot of sense.
Right.
But I've been told my whole life, oh, you can't believe that there's anything but 7 literal days of creation if you are to be a Christian. Yeah. I've seen friends walk away from the faith over just something like this. Right. But it's good to know that you can still be faithful to your Christian beliefs, whilst also believing that there's some truth in evolution.
Yeah.
And those two things can coexist. And you don't have to make or break your faith.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.